I started stalking my own stalker, and he turned out to be a lot more dangerous than I ever imagined. My stalker had been making my life a living hell for a few months, first appearing in my life by telling me to look outside, and when I did, I found photographs of me in my garden. Over time, he started leaving threats at my doorstep, contacting me and sending me more pics of myself. I was majorly creeped out, and my last straw was when I came home to find my guitar had been placed in a different room. I went to the police immediately, but for some reason they refused to do anything, saying I didn't have enough evidence, and so I took matters into my own hands and began stalking my stalker. Since he would stay outside my apartment building, hang around my favorite coffee shop, and show up at the gym I go to, I started doing the same thing to him. And if he would follow me to the grocery store, visit the exact park where I jogged, and linger around the local library, I would follow him just the same. I was determined to learn his routine to get to the bottom of this. The notes continued throughout this time, and it was very clear that he had not yet noticed I was doing the same as him. Now, believe it or not, it wasn't as hard as I thought it would be. I figured out his identity through some digging online. I didn't know much about him at first, but that changed quickly. I looked through Google to try to find social media accounts, public records, and browsed websites that gave free background checks. I started following him everywhere he went, keeping detailed notes of his activities. I documented his routines, his interactions, and even the shady places that he hung around often. It was a dangerous game, but I was determined to put an end to this. Following this man was difficult, considering he was stalking my every move first. I noticed he had a pattern to his movements, a precise way that he went about his day that made it easy to predict where he'd be and when. I followed him to work, to the bars he drank at, and even to his home. I'd park a block away and watch from a distance, my heart pounding every time he looked in my direction. I started noticing that he was actually a rather sad individual, with no family and no real friends. It didn't make him less of a psychopath in my eyes, but there's something very sad about watching a man drink whiskey all alone under a bridge at 3 a.m. Throughout the time I spent stalking him, I played it safe, and let him continue stalking me as well to not draw attention. I would often catch him looking at me on my way to work, or at the gym, or down the same aisle as me at the store, but I acted as if I didn't notice a thing. The notes continued, but him coming into my house stopped. I continued my normal routine, so that when he would run his rounds, I was exactly where he expected me to be each day. One rainy night around 2:30 a.m., I had followed him to this sketchy spot near a bar. Brian paid careful attention to his surroundings that night, making sure he wasn't seen. He had a heavy-looking duffel bag walking across the street and went inside an abandoned warehouse. I parked a little ways away to not draw attention to myself and snuck in. I peeked over the wooden box that I was hiding behind and saw a couple of goons speaking with him, but I was too far away to hear them. He dropped the suitcase in front of them as if expecting something in return. As I tried to listen closer, I made eye contact with the one to the left of Brian. He shouted, exposing my location. One goon picked up the duffel bag. My heart started beating out of my chest. I ran outside and they chased after me. I heard a couple of firearm shots zoom past me. When I got outside, I saw some people around my car, which I assumed were part of their crew, and didn't know where to turn. If I turned around, I might meet my end, and if I ran to my car, they would snatch me up before I could unlock the door, and God knows what they would have done to me. The only option I had left was to head for the woods nearby. They were close on my tail and could hear their footsteps behind me. I ran and ran until my lungs gave out. I eventually was so deep in the woods that they couldn't find me. It had gotten too dark, and the rain hindered their eyesight. I felt a wave of relief, knowing I was still alive. After all of that, I still hadn't found enough incriminating evidence on him, because the shots themselves were worth nothing. Over the months, I collected a disturbing amount of information about him. He wasn't just stalking me, he was involved in some seriously messed up stuff. I found out he had a history of harassing people, and there were even acts of violence in his past. He had secrets he definitely didn't want to get out, and I had the evidence to expose him. The stuff that I found out about this guy belonged on the dark web. I discovered that he had been fired from multiple jobs but always without reason, and there were rumors that he had ties to some sketchy underground groups involved in substance dealings. He was a disturbed man, and I was just one of his many targets. The more I learned about him, the more I realized how dangerous he was. I had to make sure he wouldn't hurt anyone else. I had pages of notes, photos, and recordings of conversations he had no idea I was listening to. I knew where he went, who he talked to, and what he did when he thought no one was watching. It became harder to follow him as much because the time he spent stalking me would often overlap with the time that I tried to get more information on him, and I knew that I couldn't keep getting away with this. I was terrified of what he'd do if he found out that I'd been stalking him for months. Throughout this time, his stalking on me had eased up a little, but the odd note was still placed under my wiper blades. I had to get him to stop, but didn't know exactly how yet. Finally, I decided it was time to confront him. I waited until I knew he'd be alone, and cornered him near a private club one evening. My heart was pounding. I told him I knew everything about him. I laid it all out. The harassment, the shady dealings, the violence. I told told him I'd share it all online if he didn't back off. For a moment, he looked genuinely scared. His eyes widened and asked me if I was following him. I told him that I was, and that I had been for months. I told him I knew everything, and if he didn't back off, I'd make sure everyone else knew too. He seemed genuinely afraid of what might happen if his dirty laundry was aired out. He promised to leave me alone, and for a few months, he did. I started to relax. I thought that maybe this nightmare was finally over. I returned to my normal routine and tried to forget the months of fear and paranoia. I was almost shocked at how easy it was to get rid of him. But then, one night, I woke up to the sound of someone breaking into my house. He was back, and he was furious. He broke down my door and was headed up the stairs. I was scared as I heard him come down the hallway. I tried to look for anything to defend myself, and that is when he stormed in. He had a wild look in his eyes that was full of rage. His presence sent chills down my spine. That's when he lunged at me. We fought. He knocked me down onto floor and socked me time and time again, until I reached over and picked up my TV remote, which had fell off of the bed. I jabbed him in his side and got him off of me. While on top of him, I tried to restrain him, but he put up a good fight. He reached up for my collar and headbutted me. The room turned black for a second, and I felt dizzy. I held my face as the red started running down my nose. I stood up to see him still on the floor. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a blade. He swung, and I dodged it. I kneed him in the dome, and he fell to the ground with a thud. He seemed to be out, and I knew this was my chance. I looked around the room for anything I could use to tie him up. I quickly settled with a thick belt that I found in my closet. I pull him over and tie his hands behind his back. I barely managed to subdue him and called the police. After a couple minutes, he came to, and I told him that I called the police. He tried to get up, but quickly realized he couldn't go anywhere. I asked him why. Why did he come back? He told me that the people he was working for knew all of the information that I found on him. They said that he had to take me out to save their behinds, because if their business reached the public, they were all going down. Eventually, the police arrived and he was arrested. They asked me if I wanted to press charges, and I knew I had to for my own safety. I thought that this would be the end of it, but he had his own trick up his sleeve. He threatened to press charges against me for stalking him, and he had enough evidence to make a strong case. I was terrified. I couldn't risk my life being ruined over this, so I agreed to drop the charges. The following week, in the most strange turn of events imaginable, we agreed to meet at a coffee shop to make some sort of agreement. He wanted to make sure we were on the same page about the information I had found about him and the traces to the people he was working for. It was supposed to be a quick, tense meeting, but it turned into something else entirely. We started talking, really talking for the first time. We shared how the past year had affected our lives, the stress, the fear, and the paranoia. It was bizarre, but in that conversation we found a strange sense of understanding. He sighed and rubbed his temples. "You have no idea what it's been like," he said. "After dealing with you and the guys above me, I didn't even know if I was going to make it out of there alive. I tried to get my life together. I really did. But everything just kept falling apart. I lost my main job, my girlfriend left me, and my friends turned their backs on me. It felt like the universe was punishing me." He told me that he started blaming me for everything, and found joy in stalking me. But overall, it only made things worse for him. He then admitted he'd been dealing with even more demons, and figured that stalking me was a twisted way of coping. I shared how the whole experience had turned my life upside down. We were both brutally honest with each other, and by the end of it, we reached a strange sort of peace. I asked why did he do it. I was genuinely curious. Why did he start following me? He told me he didn't know why I was his target at first, and that it had something to do with him being bored and angry at the world, and that I seemed to have it all together, and it just made him mad. He told me he wanted to mess with me, and eventually see if he could shake me. I told him that he definitely succeeded, and we laughed. He did admit that it got a bit out of hand, and he didn't know how to stop after a while, especially after I admitted I started stalking him. After our long conversation, we decided that we would both drop everything the info found, and the charges. No more stalking or threats. We left that coffee shop with an unspoken understanding. We wouldn't see each other again, but we had a bond. I never thought I'd find myself in this situation, but here I am. My stalker became a friend, and my life was forever changed. The weeks that followed were surreal. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for him to show up again, or for the police to come knocking at my door, but nothing happened. It was as if we'd both silently agreed to erase the past year from our lives. I started to rebuild my routine, slowly shedding the paranoia that had a hold on me for so long. I went back to the gym and reconnected with friends, and even took a few days off work to clear my head. Life was returning to normal, or at least a new version of normal. One day, as I was walking through the park, I spotted him sitting on a bench. My first instinct was to turn around and leave, but then he saw me and waved. Eventually, I walked over and sat down next to him. I told him it was fancy seeing him there, and he laughed and turned to me and said it was a nice day and that he wanted to get some fresh air. We sat in an awkward silence for a few minutes, then he spoke again and told me how he started going to therapy to work out some of his issues. I said that was great and hoped that it worked out for him. We talked for a while longer, sharing more about our lives and the things we were doing to move forward. It was strange, but in that moment, I felt a sense of closure. She was trying to be better, and so was I. As I got up to leave, he looked at me and said, "See you around?" I replied, "I hope not."